Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be finishing up part 2 of my review of the Edifier Hecate G3M Pro. Now, thank you very much again to MechKeys, who was kind enough to send this unit out for review. I greatly appreciate it. Now, this is a very unique mouse. One that's a very unique feature that I've really never seen before with this adjustable like gaming silent mode switches. I will say though, just right off the top, because this mouse does have this silent and gaming mode switch, and because it's a budget mouse, I'm going to be reviewing the G3M Pro from the perspective of a work hybrid mouse, very similar to how I reviewed the Keychron mice, just because this mouse does not feel like a true gaming mouse to me, and if I was to review this from the perspective of a gaming mouse, this would not be a good review. So I want to make sure I'm reviewing this from the right perspective of a work hybrid mouse, so just keep that in mind as I go through the rest of this video. Now, before we get into it, as always, I will have timestamps down in the video description if you're looking for a particular topic, and this video will be fully subtitled for ease of viewing. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. First off, we're going to talk about the G3M's shell shape. All right, now in terms of dimensions, the G3M shape is 119 millimeters long, 61 millimeters wide, and 39 millimeters high, and it is a symmetrical right-handed mouse. You can use this as a left-handed mouse, but there will be no buttons as they are only on the right side of the mouse. Now, the shape of the mouse is kind of similar to what we saw in the Keychron M3 and M3 mini series, where it has that like kind of exaggerated hourglass shape, but of course here on the G3M Pro it's less exaggerated. It has a less of a pronounced rear hump and a less pronounced flare towards the back of the mouse. But surprisingly, despite this being a bit of a smaller mouse, it is actually surprisingly comfortable for my 7.5 by 5 inch hands. I can comfortably fingertip this mouse or do a very aggro claw. Now, of course, I have very big hands, so I'm not necessarily the advertised use case for this very small mouse. So this mouse is definitely going to be more suited towards people with small to medium sized hands. With those hand sizes, it's going to be compatible with pretty much every single grip style. For bigger hands like mine, you're pretty much only going to be able to use fingertip or very aggressive claw grip. But despite the limitations for my larger hands with gripping the G3M Pro, this mouse was actually very comfortable for me to do work and game on. It was very comfortable. I never ran into any kind of strain problems, and the natural kind of hourglassness of the shape of the mouse did make it very comfortable for fingertip grip, which is wonderful to see. So overall, a very well executed shape. It is surprisingly comfortable, but of course definitely made for medium to smaller hands. All right, now in terms of the coating, the G3M Pro is a non-coated mouse. Given the price point of this being a kind of a budget mouse, that is understandable, but the mouse kind of has a raw plastic feel, but it does have a little bit of a grippiness to it. But if your hands are wet or if you have like sweaty or oily hands, this mouse does get very slippery very quick. This mouse does not come with any grip tape either. Again, given a budget mouse, that makes sense. So I would recommend using some aftermarket grips on this mouse if you're going to be using it for gaming. For general office use, it was completely fine. All right, next up, let's talk about the weight and balancing here on the G3M Pro. Now, this mouse is advertised as coming in at 63 grams, which is definitely a little high for a tiny mouse like this, but we'll talk about why it's so heavy in a little bit. But with the stock seats, my G3M Pro weighs in right around the 63 gram range, coming in at 63.10 grams. Now, I'm actually very happy to see this, because commonly on more budget-oriented mice, we often see some very inaccurate weight specs. I mean, realistically speaking, we see that on every single mouse out there on the market. There's very rarely we find a mouse that's actually within the advertised weight, but I'm very happy to see this only be like a 1/10 of a gram off the advertised weight, which is wonderful to see. So props to Edifier Hecate here. They've done a very good job with the weight advertisements. And again, this mouse is definitely a little heavy for being so small, but there's a reason for it, and that is because of the mouse's build quality. All right, now in terms of build quality and QC, this is where the overall weight of this mouse kind of comes into play, because this mouse is built like an absolute truck. There is zero creaking, flexing across this entire unit. The outer shell is a very hard, thick plastic. On top of that, the inside, there is some extra weight added on for the extra switches, which we'll talk about in a moment. But overall, the weight kind of justifies the incredibly good build quality we see here on the G3M, which is really nice to see. I think the only other mouse I've tried in my time that has this good build quality is the Vaxi mice. So that is very impressive. Again, props to Edifier Hecate. They've done a really good job with the overall build quality here. Would it be nice to see this mouse be a little lighter? Yes, but again, they'd most likely have to sacrifice on build quality, which I'm okay with the trade-off in this situation. So overall, while it is 63 grams, it is a little heavier for such a tiny mouse. The build quality 100% justifies that. Also, in terms of QC, the G3M Pro is also very well QC'd. I'm actually quite impressed, because commonly we see like cheaper budget mice often have a lot of QC problems, but this mouse actually feels perfect, which is very impressive. So again, props to Edifier Hecate. They've done a really good job with both the build quality and the QC here on the G3M Pro. All right, now let's talk about the main clicks, because this is where the G3M Pro gets very interesting. Now, the G3M Pro probably has the most aggressive main button design I've ever seen on a mouse. It has these very deep grooved clicks that get a little less deep as you go up towards the shell, but it's still the most aggressive groove, I guess you could say, for a mouse click I've ever seen. This actually does benefit the G3M in some ways though, because the mouse doesn't have any coating and the clicks don't have any coating either. So having these very deep grooves in the main clicks actually makes it very easy for your fingers to stay in proper position, which is a good thing, just maybe a little aggressive compared to a lot of other mice we've seen before. Now inside, the G3M is using two separate mouse switches. They're using a standard Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot for the clicking gaming mode, and then is also using a Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot silent switch. Now I'm going to talk about the switches in a moment. I wanted to talk about how this adjustable switch design works first. Now, how this adjustable switch works is that there's like a little slider rail on the inside of this mouse with a PCB for both the silent and the gaming mode switches. And what you can do is you can use the little switch on the bottom of the mouse to push this clicks into position. I'll talk about this more in the teardown video when I take this mouse apart, but it is actually a very simple but a very well implemented design, very similar to kind of how Ponage did their adjustable sensor on their Stormbreaker. Now, first off, I'm going to talk about the main buttons in the gaming mode, so I'll give you a sound test for the gaming switches first. Now, in the gaming mode, out of a scale of 10, I'd say the side buttons are about a 4 in terms of actuation weight. They do have a lot of pre and post travel, but the clicks do feel consistent across the entire shell click, which is nice. The buttons are fairly well stabilized. There is a little bit of wobble if you push them out of the way, but the slight wobble isn't going to impact your use case on the G3M at all. Now, the G3M's main clicks do have a decent rebound, but due to the high degree of pre and post travel, they're not nearly as spammable as other like gaming optimized mice. Now, given that this is a hybrid work gaming mouse, I really don't mind the less... Oh, hello, mel0n. We have been joined by mel0n. mel0n's going to join us for our recording session. But given the work hybrid use case of the G3M Pro, I don't mind this. The clicks feel pretty solid overall. Again, they're not going to be as good as like a pure gaming mouse, but it is still a pretty good implementation overall. All right, now I'll give you a quick little sound test for the silent switches. Now, on a scale of 10, the silent switches are significantly lighter than the gaming mode switches in terms of their actuation weight. I would say it feels like a 2 out of 10. They're actually so light, I often found myself mix actuating these main buttons pretty commonly when they were in the silent mode. There's not as much pre-travel as the gaming clicks, but it has the same amount of post-travel. Now, I will say, surprisingly, the clicks do feel consistent across the entire shell click, which is impressive to see, and the stabilization feels the same as the main clicks. The clicks do have a decent rebound, but because of the post-travel and the silent switch, which is a different design from the main switch, they do feel very mushy. As I said in my unboxing video, they remind me of those old like membrane IBM keyboard switches. It feels very, very similar to that. Now, personally speaking, I don't really like these silent mode switches because they're just too light for me to use. I like the idea of the silent mode switches for gaming and work. It's a cool idea, but in reality, I just end up using the gaming mode switches all the time. The silent switches just felt worse in pretty much every way possible. And it's a shame too, because they could have just done another silent switch, like a more traditional switch that probably would have done a lot better. Of course, though, because this is a budget work hybrid mouse, that would probably increase the cost of the unit. So I understand why they went for these very unique pillar silent switches, but the implementation isn't that great. Another issue with the silent switches is that they only have a 1 million click lifespan, where the 1.0 blue shell standard switches that we see for the gaming mode have 80 million. So there's also a lifespan issue here as well, because these clicks are going to die significantly faster than the other clicks are. Again, realistically speaking, are you ever going to hit that barrier with the clicks? Probably not. So while the concept of this silent game mode switch is really cool, in reality, this silent gaming mode switch feature just really feels kind of useless and unnecessary, and I generally feel like the mouse would have been better if they just put in the 1.0 blue shell pink dot switches and took out the silent switches. This mouse would feel significantly better. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about these side buttons here for the G3M. Now, the side buttons are these very small, slightly tilted, flattened side buttons. They are very, very recessed in the shell, so much so they're almost flush with the side of the shell, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they can be kind of tricky to actuate sometimes. The side buttons are non-coated just like the rest of the G3M shell, so they can get a little slippery sometimes, but again, it's not that big of a deal because it's a work gaming mouse. I'll give you a quick little sound test here of the side buttons. Now, inside, the G3M Pro is using the 1.0 white dot switches for these side buttons, the pretty common switches we see on pretty much every mice right now. In terms of actuation weight, on a scale of 10, I'd say the side buttons are about a 4 out of 10, very similar to the feeling of the main buttons. The side buttons have basically no pre-travel, but a little bit of post-travel, but they do feel a lot better than the main clicks because they have much better response, and the lack of post-travel makes them feel very snappy. The button stabilization is also very good. The buttons don't wobble, and there's no real play on either side of the buttons. Overall, the side buttons are actually very, very well implemented. I'm actually very impressed with the side buttons. They feel very, very solid. Alrighty, and then we'll talk about the scroll wheel. Now, the scroll wheel is a rubber winged wheel. It almost has like a tire tread like texturing to it. The scroll wheel as a whole is very pronounced from the shell, so it does sit out quite a bit. Very similar to the scroll wheel on the Keychron M2 series mice. Now, inside, the G3M Pro is using an F-Switch 7S encoder, which is, I believe, the exact same one we saw on the Keychron mice. In terms of scroll force out of 10, the scroll wheel is about a 4 out of 10. It's a very light scroll wheel with pretty pronounced scroll points. The scroll wheel switch is an unknown pillar switch. I believe it's a 1.0 yellow dot pillar switch because it's using a 1.0 yellow dot for the DPI button at the top of the mouse, so I'm going to assume it's the same. Now, in terms of the scroll wheel click on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of actuation, it's about a 7 out of 10. It is pretty heavy. Again, this is kind of par for the course for a scroll wheel click, but it's a little too heavy for my taste. But aside from the click being a little heavy, the scroll wheel implementation is actually very, very solid. Another really cool thing is that inside the G3M Pro, this is using a very unique way of installing a PCB for a scroll wheel and a side button switch. It's very, very unique the way they've done it on the inside. I'll talk about that more in my teardown video that'll be coming out in a couple days, but the actual internal construction of how they've done this is actually very impressive. But overall, the implementation of the scroll wheel is actually very good. The only downside, quote unquote, to it is the slightly heavy scroll wheel click, but that's a very, very minimal thing. Alrighty, now despite the G3M Pro being a rather budget-oriented mouse, this mouse actually has some pretty solid specs on the inside. So it is using a Pixar 3395 DMT6QU. Now this is a stock version of the 3395, so it does have the max DPI of 26,000, but the implementation is a little odd in terms of sensor options, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now the MCU is a very unique one. This is a Vision VS09M37A, which I have not seen yet. I know some mice in the past, like the Keychron mice, use some very unique MCUs like the Telelink MCU, but I have not seen a Vision MCU yet. So a bit of a unique choice for this mouse. Again, it being a budget mouse, this kind of makes sense while we're seeing some unique tech on the inside here. But in terms of performance, it actually does perform pretty well, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, one thing I did want to mention here is that Edifier Hecate is advertising the G3M Pro as having some very interesting claims in terms of wireless performance. Apparently, it has flash speed wireless, ultra low latency wireless, and ultra low non-inductive wireless delay. Now, given the MCU here, I do have some questions about that because there is a noticeable difference between a Nordic 52840 and the Telelink MCUs that we saw on these Keychron mice, and I have a feeling this Vision MCU is definitely not going to be as good as they say it is, because I have done some digging and I cannot find a single mouse out on the market aside from this one that is using a Vision MCU. There may be other kinds of Vision MCUs, but I cannot find a single other mouse on the market using this tech. So while Edifier Hecate is saying all this stuff about the gaming performance, keep in mind this is a work hybrid mouse. This is designed for work and play. So I would definitely take what they're saying about this end-to-end latency and their 1 millisecond response time with their gaming performance with a grain of salt. Now, unfortunately, I do not own an LDAT or any way of actually testing the latency on this product. So just take what Edifier is saying here with a grain of salt, because this MCU is very odd, and considering it's not used in anything else on the market right now, I would take these gaming performance claims with a grain of salt. But regardless of the marketing claims and the odd MCU choice here, the G3M Pro does perform very well overall. The 3295, as I mentioned before, is a stock one with a 26,000 DPI main sensor, but from what I can tell, motion sync and ripple are disabled. The only feature that is available on this sensor is angle snapping, which is a little odd. The features may be enabled by default, but may not be showing in their software, so I'm not really sure what's going on with that. Again, this is a work gaming mouse, so I do understand why they're not really having motion sync as like a selling feature on this mouse, but regardless of the oddities of some features not being available on it, overall the performance is good. I would just take Edifier Hecate's claims about their gaming performance with a grain of salt, just because it's a very unique and unknown MCU. All right, now since the G3M Pro is a work gaming mouse, this is going to have tri-connectivity, which is wonderful to see. So it does have wired USB-C usage, 2.4 gigahertz wireless, and Bluetooth. Now, for the majority of the review, I did most of my testing on wireless and wired connection, but I did test the Bluetooth connection. It did work completely fine. However, keep in mind, Bluetooth will cap your polling rate to 125 hertz. You cannot go to 500 or 1000 on this mouse, which are only available over the wired or wireless technology. But overall connectivity is solid. Didn't run into any issues across all of my testing, so it's a very well implementation of the tri-connectivity here on the G3M Pro. Alrighty, and then next up I want to talk about the battery life. Now, the G3M is using a 300 mAh battery, which is pretty standard for a lot of mice we're seeing nowadays. Now, Edifier Hecate is advertising his mouse to have a 70-hour battery life, but they are not specifying whether this is for gaming use or office use. Now, from my experience, if you're using this for gaming, the mouse does die pretty quickly. I'd probably say for gaming use, you're going to get maybe 50 hours out of it, maybe 60, depending on your use case. For office use, it's going to be much longer, of course. Now, the reason why there's such a variance in the battery life is that there's no way to turn off or adjust the auto sleep on this mouse. I believe the auto sleep is 30 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. But of course, if you're using it as an office mouse, it's going to go auto sleep a lot more frequently than it will if you're doing gaming. So just keep in mind, there will be a bit of a variance depending on your battery use case here. Overall, it is still pretty good for a mouse this small. It does feel pretty solid overall, but it is a little weird in terms of its overall battery life depending on your use case. In terms of charging time on the G3M, it's pretty good. I was able to charge the mouse from 25% to full in about an hour or so. So overall charging is pretty good. Again, the only kind of oddity about this is the battery life is going to be pretty fluctuative depending on your use case, but given that it's a work gaming mouse, this is kind of par for the course. Overall, no real complaints in terms of the battery life. All right, now I also want to talk about the software. Now, the software is pretty basic, pretty lightweight, fairly easy to navigate. As I mentioned before, there is no way to adjust the auto sleep, but oddly enough, there's no way to disable mouse buttons. I wanted to disable the DPI button on the top of the mouse just because I kept hitting it accidentally and switching my DPI, but there's no way to disable that, which I thought was very odd. You can change it to like a bunch of other things, but there's no way to disable it, which is just very odd. So that is one downside, but aside from that, the software is okay. Now, one good thing is that you can have multiple profiles on the mouse. So if you wanted to set a work and gaming profile, you can do that, and you can change the DPI button to swap the profiles, which is a good thing. But again, it would be nice to see an option to disable keys, but that's a pretty minimal thing. But overall, the software is okay, pretty lightweight. You're probably going to turn it on, set your things, and never use it again, which is what you're supposed to do with software. So I'm happy to see a very lightweight, fairly easy to use software here for the G3M Pro. All right, then I also want to talk about the stock skates here on the G3M Pro. Now, these are just very standard PTFE quote unquote skates. They're pretty standard, nothing really to write home about. They're just standard use case skates you're going to find on pretty much any kind of office mouse out there. They do work very well for the gaming use hybrid case on this mouse. I did end up removing mine and installing the ESP Tiger Yenzi dot just because I prefer the feeling of the dots over the full-size stocks, but the full-size stocks were pretty good. Also, one really nice thing is there is actually skate removal ramps on the bottom of this mouse, so it is very easy to remove the stocks, which is a really nice attention to detail. So overall, the stock skates are going to be good for like 99.9% of people. The only reason I took them off is I just wanted to try out the Yenzi dots on this mouse. Alrighty, and lastly, I want to talk about repairability. Now, I definitely had some concerns about repairability for this mouse because of this adjustable switch thing. I didn't really know how it was going to work when I was writing the script for this video, so I definitely had some concerns about repairability. But to my surprise, this is actually an incredibly easy to service mouse, which is a really nice change of pace. Commonly on like budget or hybrid use mice, sometimes they're very, very difficult to repair just because you cut a lot of corners with the manufacturing. But Edifier has actually done a very good job of designing this mouse on the inside. It's actually very easy to service, and as I mentioned before, they're doing some really unique tricks for the installation for the scroll wheel and the side buttons, which is a really cool thing to see. I will talk more about this in my full teardown of the G3M Pro coming out in a couple days, so if you want to see how this mouse is built on the inside, be sure to get subscribed from that. But in terms of repairability, it is actually a very, very serviceable mouse, very easy to open up, clean, and replace parts if you have to. Alrighty, but overall, in terms of final thoughts, the Edifier Hecate G3M Pro is actually a very, very unique mouse. Maybe a little too unique because, again, as I mentioned before, this silent gaming mode switch does feel kind of pointless to a degree because the silent switches feel so bad. Maybe in the future, it'd be nice to see a version of this mouse without the silent switches, or maybe like a different kind of tactile switch or like a standard kind of tactile switch. That would be something nice to see. But aside from the silent mode switches being kind of underwhelming, my only other real quote unquote complaint with this mouse is the weight. But again, this weight is also giving this mouse some incredibly good build quality, so that is a bit of a trade-off there. But overall, for a work hybrid gaming mouse, the G3M is actually very good. Edifier Hecate has done a very, very good job with this mouse. I'm very interested to see how like a pure gaming mouse would look from them, because they've done a lot of really cool things right that a lot of brands miss on budget mice. I'm very interested to see how like a full-scale gaming mouse from them would look, but that'll have to be a video for another time. But that is everything for my review of the Edifier Hecate G3M Pro. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much again to Mel0n, who was kind enough to send this out for review. I greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to learn more about the Edifier Hecate G3M, I will have the product link down in the video description for you. But that is everything for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.